They said the ledger was found sealed inside a church wall during renovation. Every page was soaked in something dark, as if the ink had bled through from the other side. Each line carried a name, a date, and one word written in a trembling hand: returned. No one wanted to admit what it meant. A century ago, in a small Texas town that no longer appears on maps, a slave was sold again and again. Each man who bought him died soon after, and each death was marked in that same ledger. The church denied it, the orphanage claimed the records were burned, the town buried its guilt under sermons and stained glass, but history doesn't forget what men try to erase. And beneath the fields of East Texas, under the old seminary ruins, something waits, a truth too heavy for prayers, too deep for graves. They called him Henry, others called him Elijah, no one ever called him free. In 1845, the Republic of Texas had just been annexed. Tobacco smoke drifted through the wooden boardwalks of small frontier towns. The wind off the Rio Grande whispered of conquest and unspoken debts. In the plantation hinterlands, cotton smelled of sweat and blood. It was into this world that the slave known only as Henry arrived at the age of 14, a boy seized from a squalid Richmond holding, penned and sold at auction to a family known for its veneer of piety. The buyer was a minister's son who believed his purchase could redeem Henry's soul. He paid more than market price as though to cleanse his own guilt, but beneath the white clapboard veneer, the town's church and orphanage shared a dark covenant. The preacher, the overseer of the orphanage, and the cotton baron who funded both, met clandestinely, talked softly behind locked doors about the cost of redemption and the measure of sin. It was a place where guilt could be monetized and souls could be discussed in ledger entries rather than prayers. Henry didn't speak much. His silence was a protective shell. Yet something in his eyes belied an ancient wound, a trauma older than America, that grew in the damp clay of Texas, fed by the whispered cruelties of men who believed themselves ordained. And so the stage is set. Land stretched wide, institutions rising proud, and a boy who should have been invisible, standing at the threshold of something monstrous. In the summer heat of 1850, the minister's son, William Garner, afflicted with recurring fever and convulsions, brought Henry into his household. Garner believed Henry would elevate his standing, evoking compassion, showing the town his piety. Henry's tasks were sweeping the floors, cleaning the church pews, delivering sermons the minister left unfinished. Late at night, Garner's nightmares began. Indistinct forms scratching at his window, muffled cries from the shuttered orphan wing, the faint rattle of chains. On a hot, humid night, Garner collapsed in the pulpit. Blood bubbled at his lips. No medical record accounted for it. The doctors called it ague and spasmodic cholera. But the next morning, Garner was found in the pulpit with the sermon open, his right hand frozen in a writing posture. Process begun. Henry was gone. The yard showed no tracks. His cabin wall was intact, but for a single gouge deep in the wood, like a claw mark. The orphanage priests, coolers heard someone crying, someone who didn't belong. The local preacher whispered to his wife, "We must hide what Henry knows." They buried a cemetery ledger and assigned Henry a new master. And the first death turned into rumor. No one dared speak Henry's name. Every man who bought him felt the weight of the unseen. And the town's church realized the ledger held more than alms, it held secrets. By the time the second buyer arrived, the threads of vengeance were already pulled. The town's orphanage, an imposing brick building funded by the Cotton Barons Association, served as the face of benevolence. Children wore crisp white dresses. The preacher's wife read Bible verse by the fountain. But behind the shutters, at night, children shivered in the dormitory, hearing soft footsteps and the rattle of unseen chains. When Henry was transferred there by the second buyer, the orphanage's head matron closed his file, erased the slave status, and listed him as ward. The church donated him books. The barons gifted new wings. The institution swallowed him. At twilight, a boy named Thomas reported hearing a man singing old spirituals in a room that no one entered. The matron hushed him, spoke of the voices of the lost, and bade him go to bed. The ledger at the orphanage listed donors, children, meals, but one column remained obscured, scratched out. That column recorded the number of men who purchased Henry, and each name was followed by a date of death. The ledger was hidden behind a wall panel in the basement. The adults believed in redemption through charity. The barons believed in power through appeasement. But Henry believed in something older, a contract deeper than bondage, written in the clay of ancestors carried across oceans, inked in sweat and blood. He was the institution's ghost asset. The orphanage disguised the transfer. The church blessed it. The barons ignored it. In this triangle of corruption, Henry became the symbol of suppressed truth and unspoken horror. By 1862, whispers circulated in the town. They spoke of a figure called Elijah the Avenger. No one knew if he was Henry reborn or some old spirit awakened in a mortal shell. Reverend Roberts, head of the church, caught glimpse of a tall silhouette in the flickering candle-lit vestibule, carrying a torch trailing chains. He chalked the figure into the margin of his private journal. He waits in the orphan corridor. The orphanage children claim to wake at night hearing a hammer pounding, the echo of a coffin lid being sealed. One night, one of the cotton barons, a man named Randall Baines, disappeared. His body was found weeks later near the river, arms broken, face unrecognizable, a single index finger pointing upward. The local doctor hesitated, called it missing persons. The church recorded a memorial service. The orphanage scheduled extra prayers, but the ledger behind the wall showed Baines's name and a date. Henry's name was nowhere to be found. Elijah's legend filled the gap. In the town square, old wives lit lanterns and said, "He takes the byres, leavened by old sorrows." The barons laughed behind closed doors, said the slaves were property, not people. But inside the orphanage, the children trembled when the wind moaned through the upper windows. The church bells tolled at midnight for no reason. And Henry, or Elijah, was living the unspoken, pursuing men who thought they could purchase redemption through him. Meanwhile, the institution cemented its facade and the trauma deepened. Nearby, the seminary of the Church St. Cecilia's Theological Seminary opened a special divine servitude program in 1870. Seminary students were encouraged to purchase slaves as part of their humility training. The school claimed it taught spiritual leadership, and the congregation believed the seminary anointed moral men. When one such student, Elijah Marks, bought Henry for the symbol of humility, he assumed his act would carry spiritual merit. What he didn't know was that Henry carried a wound older than servitude. He didn't know that the seminary building abutted the orphanage basement through hidden crawl spaces. Late at night, students reported whispers behind the bookcases, a presence watching from behind the altar shadows. The seminary turned a blind eye. Faculty dismissed it as overactive imaginations. But Marks vanished one morning, his bed empty, sandals left by the prayer rug. His roommate discovered a muddy shoe print with a deep gouge in the dormitory floor. The ledger jotted Marks E4/12/1008, 171 Doa. Seminary archives denied any record of the purchase. The church paid for his tombstone but never listed the cause of death. Institutions stacked their silence like bricks. The orphanage sealed its ledger. The seminary marked its students as exchanged or transferred. The church preached obedience, and Henry, renamed Elias by the seminary to erase his past, watched, listened, waited. He had become the instrument of a hidden justice. By the end of the century, the pattern was clear. Every man who purchased Henry, or his aliases, met an early, brutal end. One drowned in a cotton bale accident. Another burned in the orphanage furnace late at night. The official records blamed industrial mishap, accidental electrocution, natural causes. But in the ledger, each death was followed by a date of purchase. And there were no photographs, only grainy census records. The town's newspaper printed obituaries for these men. Funeral parades were held. The church offered grief counseling. The barons donated seats in the gallery. And the orphanage, quietly, accepted the charitable gifts from the wills. Outsiders came and went. No one connected the dots. Beneath it all, Henry's silence became a weapon. His presence in each household, each institution, never acknowledged but always instrumental. His gaze remained steady. He swept floors, cleaned pews, answered prayers, but he carried inside him the echo of 1,000 broken promises. There was kinship between his pact and the institution's secret. That redemption could be bought, that suffering could be hidden, that death could be traded for penance. One woman, Agnes White, the photographer's daughter, took a shot of the orphanage's facade at dusk. In the negative, behind a corner window, she believed she saw a figure in a white suit, shackles on wrists leaning out. She never published the photo, she never spoke of it. The institutions had claws. They assimilated memory, hid grief, buried truth, and the legend of Henry of Elijah and Elias grew in the darkness. In 1920, the descendant of a buyer, Charles Everett Jr., found his great-grandfather's ledger in the attic. He discovered a purchase entry, Henry alias Elias 1008, $198,625. Beneath, a faded stamp, property of St. Cecilia's Seminary. Everett, a young historian, visited the old orphanage ruins and saw the sealed basement panel. Against his better judgment, he forced it open. Inside, charred fragments of ledger pages, twisted chain links, the faint scent of soot and lost childhood. His camera shutter clicked, but the images were blurry, distorted. He left with trembling hands. That night, Everett's daughter Mary heard water dripping in the attic. She found footprints in dust leading from the ledger box to the wall, as though someone had walked in her father's path. The next morning, Everett was gone. His typewriter sat spattered with ink. All his research files were missing. The church donated a memorial grant, but included a clause, no further public inquiry. The seminary said it had shut down in 1905. The orphanage board dissolved in 1912, but the ledger, buried, hidden, unspoken, held the truth. Mary, silent and white, died, kept one photograph, a ghost-like silhouette in the attic stair, well, tall, still watching. The institutions counted on the next generation forgetting. They counted on silence, but some ghosts don't rest. Some slaves, once owned, become the ultimate owners of the men who thought they owned them. The town of Parkfield, fictional in East Texas, once booming with cotton, now dotted with abandoned mills, conceals beneath its sun-bleached frame a network of tunnels built by the orphanage and seminary administrators. These tunnels linked the orphanage cellars, the seminary library basement, and the cotton baron's warehouse. At night, the wind whistled through the sealed vaults, rats scuttled currency bags, muffled prayers echoed. Henry, or the force within him, moved through this subterranean infrastructure like a specter. The town's families, the Garner, Baines clan, the Everett line, the Roberts, Mark's progeny, met in dim rooms, clinked glasses, made offers to silence. The church raised its steeple high, the orphanage children prayed for salvation, the seminary dean lectured on sacrifice, but underneath injustice schemed. The term servitude was sanitized, avenger was never uttered. The tunnels symbolized the institutional underbelly, what the white facades hid. In the summer of 1931, a storm knocked out the power. Residents heard shrieks emanating from the tunnels. The local sheriff discovered a locked grating under a barn floor, the metal warped from heat, chains still linked to a wall. He closed his report as unidentified disturbance. The town paid it no mind. They had grown accustomed to the hum of suppressed horror, and Henry's footprints remained invisible until someone dared to follow the ledger one more time. What went on inside Henry's mind remains impossible to fully decode. He carried the trauma of kidnapping, transport, shackles, and ownership. But something more ancient rested within, a legacy of broken chains, ancestral sorrow, and a primal contract forged across continents. Each new master added to his ledger a price tag, a name, a date. Each death added to his tally. He did not speak. He did not run. He waited. The pattern became ritual. The men believed they owned the means to absolution. Instead, they fed a force of reckoning. Henry's silence became his shield and his instrument. He watched faces freeze in fear as the darkness crept in. He felt the teeth of institutions closing around him: ownership, underwriting, absolution, betrayal. In the orphanage he heard children weeping in the walls. In the seminary he heard sermons about redemption while the chains rumbled beneath. He listened to the ministers and students talk of our Christian duty, while the ledger beneath recorded sin accounted. Psychologically, Henry inhabited a space between victim and executor. He mirrored the cruelty directed at him back into the men who believed themselves righteous. He became symbol and substance. His presence forced the institutions to fracture their own narratives. He became the shadow of their faith, the ghost of their charity, the echo of their hypocrisy. And so the horror is not just what he did, but what the institutions allowed, continued, buried. In 2018, fictionally, filmmaker and researcher Sarah Blake uncovered a single photograph in a dusty archive. An image of the orphanage corridor, the seminary library stairs, a faint figure leaning in the half-light. On the negative, she saw ledger numbers scratched in the margins. She drove through East Texas, found the remains of Parkfield, and knocked on parted doors of old church offices. She spoke with descendants of the Barron families. They hung heads, poured iced tea, and politely said they had no records. She visited the orphanage basement, sealed off, walls still damp, musty. She felt the presence of unresolved history. Sarah's recorder captured the crack of chains, the whisper of children long gone, the rattle of ledger pages shifting in some unseen winds. At night, she woke to a sound like footsteps in an empty room, stopped, then redirected into the shadows. She realized the story she pursued was not just one man's vengeance. It was the story of how institutions disguise oppression as salvation. The camera followed her as she found the sealed crawl space beneath the church, and the local preacher refused to open his ledger. Her voiceover: "This place wants to forget, but forgetting is part of the cover-up." She assembled interviews, archivists, tired librarians, elderly townsfolk who remembered the midnight bells and the children's shrieks. She found minutes of orphanage board meetings that referenced slave assets in veiled language. The horror she discovered was not supernatural. It was human, institutional, persistent. And yet as she delved deeper, the presence of Henry, or whatever he had become, haunted her frames. Throughout this narrative, the motif of chains recurs. Shackles worn by the boy, chain links buried in the orphanage basement, ledger entries forming invisible chains around men's lives. The institutions offered redemption, church hymns, orphanage charity, seminary scholarship, but these promises acted as chains in reverse, binding the souls of donors and buyers. Henry broke physical chains, but he became the unseen chain, wrapping around the necks of those who sought to possess him. Visually, we see the iron links rusted and broken, the ledger written in faded ink, the orphanage windows like eyes staring out at dusk. The cotton fields stand tall, the same land that bore the boy's labor now bearing the weight of forgotten blood. The seminary's red bricks seemed holy in day's glow, but at night the bricks bled shadows. The institution's tongues proclaimed salvation, the ledger's ink spelled quota. Henry's walk across the red clay soil became the march of suppressed rage. In interviews, Sarah asks, "What is redemption when it costs another man his life?" The church says sin can be purchased, the orphanage says charity can atone, the ledger says ownership can absolve. But the pattern shows the reverse. Ownership begets death. Charity becomes silence. Henry's elimination of each buyer is less a horror story and more a dark mirror to institutional guilt. Each death is a rung in a ladder descending into deeper complicity. And in that descent we see not just the boy's vengeance, but the crushing weight of a society that believed it could own redemption. The pulpit of the church in Parkfield looked like sanctity, stained, glass windows, polished hymnal pews, the preacher's robes white and stern. But behind the scenes, the board of the church maintained its own ledger, far older than the one in the orphanage basement. It recorded purchases, assets, souls, a coded language for enslaved persons used by donors for social capital. The minister's son, William Garner, bought Henry believing he would win moral favor. The orphanage accepted the donation. The barons nodded. In the preacher's private office, a cabinet held letters, "Purchased Henry unto furtherance of the Lord's work." The ink was brittle. A diary entry by Reverend Roberts read, "The boy speaks too little. I hope his silence becomes beneficial." Beneath the doctrine of redemption, the institution practiced ownership. The slave became a symbol of charity. The institution claimed moral high ground. Meanwhile, Henry worked, watched, waited, and each man who bought him paid with more than dollars. He paid with silence, shame, and eventually death. The church's veneer cracked in one interview Sarah conducted with a retired sexton. He confessed hearing a sermon about the burden of suffering, and later seeing the orphanage wing's power go out without explanation. The pulpit was not just telling morality, it was shielding crime, and Henry embodied the shadow that the church refused to name. The horror here is institutional, systems built to save souls, destroying them instead. Sarah returned to the abandoned orphanage one evening, the building tilted with age, windows boarded, vines threaded like fingers across brickwork. She entered the basement through a fallen hatch. Her flashlight beam caught one object, an iron shackle embedded in concrete, the cruciform impression of a man's liege. She recorded the echo of dripping water, found a cavity where the ledger once lay. Taking a plaster cast, she discovered the imprint of a name, Henry/Elias/E. The scent of old wood mildew and something like charred bone filled her lungs. She climbed the stairs, emerging into the night air thick with cicada song. In the upper window, she watched a smudge of light flicker then extinguish. She felt watched. She left the orphanage, drove back through Parkfield, saw in the rear view mirror a figure at the roadside, tall, still, staring. Her heart pounded. She shut off the camera. She froze the frame. In the still image, the figure's eyes glowed faintly. Back home, she reviewed her footage. The audio picked up whispering underneath the drone of her generators. The words, bought, owned, paid, returned. She couldn't tell whether the voice was male or female, human or other. She told herself, I'm just chasing a story. But deep down she knew she'd awakened something. Something centuries old. Something that the town, the church, the orphanage had tried to bury. The ruins bore the shape of memory refusing to die. And Henry's ledger remained open, unresolved. The trauma in this story doesn't end in the 19th century. It echoes into the 20th, into the families who sold, who bought, who looked away. Generations of the Garner, Baines, Everett, Roberts, Marks families lived under the same town roof, attended the same church, sent their sons to the same seminary. They told themselves the past was resolved, redemption purchased, sins forgiven, but trauma is not a ledger entry. It lurks in the midday sweat, the orphan's sigh, the preacher's prayer. Survivors of the orphanage recalled nightmares of a man in white chains dragging them into a room. They never told their parents. They became teachers, nurses, ministers, but carried a little hump in their spine, a tremor in their voice. Their children grew up with vague memories of attic footsteps, basement rumbles. Their grandparents, why? Died warning, never ask what lies beneath. The townsfolk built memorials to the lost cotton boys, but never spoke of Henry, or the buyers, or the ledger. They erected stained glass art of a black hand raised to heaven, unlabeled, unacknowledged. In this way, the institution doesn't just hide a slave's vengeance. It hides its own making. The men who believed themselves benevolent were part of a machinery of control. The orphanage used child labor. The seminary used narrative. The church used faith, and Henry used them all or something beyond them to execute a grim justice. The horror is not only the deaths, but the living carrying the burden of silence. And so the unseen trauma flows like an underground river beneath Parkfield, reshaping lives. Sarah coordinated an interview with the last surviving member of the orphanage board, Mary Hawkins, age 92, frail and haunted. As dusk settled, Mary spoke. He came at midnight. I heard his voice in the corridor. She paused, her hand trembling. Sarah's camera rolled. Mary confessed she'd burned a ledger in 1948 when the orphanage closed. She retrieved a page that read buyer, Mansfield Tate Price, $780 date, 3/17/1929, death, suffocation. She wept. The church representative, Reverend Allen, refused camera time but allowed transcript. The ledger was our albatross. We destroyed it because it shamed us. Sarah asked, whose life did it shame? The silence answered. She insisted on entering the old seminary archives. The librarian denied access. She returned later by herself and discovered filing cabinet drawers labeled Divine Servitude Confidential. One drawer held a photograph of a young Henry standing between two seminary students, his eyes blank, his hands cut free from shackles. The photo was dated 1902. As she walked through the corridors of the seminary building at night, she felt someone behind her, smelled tobacco, heard soft laughter bounce off tile walls. She swung the camera, nothing visible, but the audio captured chain, links rattling. Her heart raced. She realized the institution didn't want stories. They wanted oblivion, and she realized Henry, or the force he embodied, had been waiting for someone to listen. The confrontation wasn't just hers. It was with every brick, every ledger, every life they covered up. In piecing together the ledger fragments, Sarah traced 73 purchase entries from 1845 to 1935. 17 cases resulted in documented deaths, but dozens more vanished, unrecorded, ignored. The purchasers' families received accident settlements. The church donated funds for bereaved widows. The orphanage accepted charitable lump sums. The pattern held name, price, date, death. But what sparked the killing? Sarah theorized. Each buyer assumed ownership of redemption, but forgot they were entering the covenant of chains. Henry, therefore, inverted the transaction. He turned ownership into debt, redemption into retribution. The footage loads show the ledger entries, the basements, the chain fragments. The townsfolk reveal memory lapses. They recall funerals but not causes. The institutions speak of books lost to fire. The seminary cancels access. Sarah's voiceover. In facade of righteousness, we built prisons of silence. The horror lies not in specters, but in ledger lines. In a town that called itself Christian, in a society that believed in the benevolence of ownership, in a world that assumed redemption could be bought, in the night, her camera cuts to the cotton field where the first buyer worked. Tall stalks rustle in wind. She walks among them with headphones. A low hum, then a chain clinks behind her. She spins around. Nothing. The fields offer no comfort. The hush is louder than screams. She whispers. He walks still, and you believe her. In the final confrontation, Sarah gathers the archive pieces, ledger fragments, photo proofs, oral testimony, chain, link cast. She projects the ledger page onto church stone walls. The names flicker in candle glow. The film cuts. The orphanage hatch creaks open. The basement empties. Footsteps ascend the stairs. Sarah follows. She finds a door sealed with church wax. She breaks it. Inside, a room with symbols. An altar, a chain, link circle, the words scrawled. Return what was taken. On the floor, the imprint of a body, the shape of a man kneeling. A single candle still flickers. She films. The figure emerges, Henry, or his ghost. Tall, silent, chains still faintly glinting. He looks at Sarah. The camera tilts up. His lips move but no sound. The image blurs. Jenna's breathing escalates. The film static. The screen momentarily black. Then the words, "He holds your ledger too." Sarah drops the camera. We hear the thud. The film goes black. A whisper, bought, owned, paid, returned. This is where the documentary stops pretending to distance itself. This is where you realize you're not just watching horror, you're witnessing the reckoning of centuries. The ledger is speaking. The institutions are trembling, and the slave who should have been dead has become the arbiter of justice no one dared articulate. In the quiet after the storm, the orphanage building sits abandoned. The church still rings bells, though fewer attend. The seminary building is now a museum for local history, but the display omits the ledger. Sarah's film launches online, views spike. Scholars contact her, townsfolk murmur. The families of buyers hunker down. The institutions issue safe statements. We cannot verify these claims. The ledger fragments go into a trust, but trauma doesn't vanish with exposure. It seeps. The townsfolk recall once forgotten nights of shadows and chains. The children of the orphanage, now old, cry at memory. The barren families scramble their archives. The church reckons with sermon lines about redemption. The seminary revises syllabi. They all feel the gaze of something that has waited long. The ripple of this event extends beyond the film. It asks, what is ownership? What is redemption? What is the price of silence? Henry's story becomes myth, but the myth reflects real systems: slavery, charity, religious institutions, buried pain. And for you, the viewer, the question lingers. When an institution claims it is saving lives, might it instead be laundering death? The ledger remains open. The chain remains unbroken. The story of Henry is unending, not because we don't know the names, but because we refuse to learn from them. We have walked through cotton fields, orphan dormitories, seminary halls, basement vaults. We have listened to adults with shaky voices, seen buildings that tremble in the dark, felt the chain, links of history slip across our skin. This is not just a horror story, it is a warning. Institutions built on benevolence may conceal darker bargains. Redemption might be the world's grandest illusion, and the ledger of injustice is written with the ink of forgetfulness. So listen. This tortured man in Texas did not awaken alone. He awoke because we slept. He claimed what should have been his: dignity, vengeance, truth, and the buyers paid, not just with their lives, but with their souls. The church, the orphanage, the seminary, they turned their eyes away, and the ground beneath them shifted. At the end you look in the mirror. Are you the buyer or the witness? Are you the institution or the mercy seeker? In the wash of morning light, chains may rust, but the marks remain. In the hush of memory, children still whisper. In the hush of your heart, the ledger ticks. The deadliest slave in Texas is no legend. He is the mirror of all unchecked power, and he is still listening.